Okay, good evening, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. We really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here tonight. I know that 7 p.m. for those of you on the East Coast and 6 p.m. for those of you in Central Time Zone is late afternoon, early evening, so we're really happy that you took the time. We are going to get started with some opening remarks in just a minute, but first I would like to thank our wonderful panelists, Commissioner Margie Van Deven, Superintendent Ayala from Illinois, Gerald Bradford from 50 CAN, and Katrina Miller from the SAS Institute. We're really appreciative of taking the time to be here. And if you have missed any of our past conversations, I know a lot of you have been here for past conversations, but if you've missed any of those, you can find recaps of those on our website, hunt-institute.org. So after our opening remarks, we will hear from our panelists for about 30 minutes, and then we'll pivot to a Q&A. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to submit those into the chat. We will not be unmuting the lines just because of the number of people here tonight. And if you have anything that you'd like to share on social media, we would love to hear from you there. You can just use the hashtag #EdHomeroom, and we'll be sure to take a look. And you can also communicate with your fellow participants on Twitter as well. I'd like to get started first by asking the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to provide some brief welcome remarks.
Thanks, Julia. I want to first thank everybody for taking time to be with us this evening. I'd also like to thank our panelists for making time in the evening hour to join us in this endeavor. I want to thank my awesome, committed staff for having the idea to go prime time and go after our work hours to try and engage a larger audience. So thanks for everybody for making time to be with us. With school's back in session, however, that might look in your home or in your states. We know that all of you have incredibly busy schedules. So we try to enter the prime time with our first endeavor with this homeroom with education leaders. So I'm hopeful this will be a successful conversation. This evening's webinar is going to address the important topic of measuring student growth, a conversation that I have long enjoyed for the past 20 years. But we're still mucking through this really important conversation. So I'm excited to see what our panelists are going to share with us this evening. One of the many questions educators have raised is how to equitably and meaningfully identify where students are after being out of a physical classroom for so long. Typically, when students return to school in the fall, educators are prepared. They already expect they won't have retained all that they have learned the year before. Most also know that the amount retained is usually dependent on certain inequities, such as access to summer programs, technology access, food security. But when we combine the summer break with the months that students were not in a physical classroom due to COVID, the equity gap is likely to have widened as certain more privileged students were able to more easily move forward with learning, while other students continue to be impacted by the inequities we've always known to exist. So I'm excited to see how our panelists are going to endeavor this conversation. Again, I thank all of you for making time in the evening hour. With that, I'll turn it over to Julia to get our conversation going. Julia.
Thanks so much, Javed. I'd like to just jump right on in. We're going to first hear from Katrina Miller, who is the Director of Educational Partnerships at the SAS Institute. Katrina, to get us started, can you talk about some of the ways that educators around the country are really responding creatively to the challenges that schools and students are facing right now, especially as it relates to measuring student growth in the wake of all these closures we've seen?
Yes, thank you, Julia, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for hosting this webinar and having me join you. I work at the SAS Institute, where we've been measuring growth for over 20 years at SAS, but with a growth model that's been in place for almost 30 years now. And we work with a variety of states and over 10 million students. So I feel like we have a really good background in understanding this. And while the pandemic is very new and something that none of us have ever experienced before, we have experienced things like missed testing. There was a state in 2015 that had an issue with their test vendor and weren't able to give a test, but they were able to use a growth measure and maintain a stability in growth over time. And we're working with many states in doing that still, using a 2-year growth measure to look back and look forward to 2021, but also really thinking critically about the data that we need in doing this? Do we have the information about what students are doing in the interim? Are they taking online classes? Are they in a hybrid environment? Did they have access to broadband or devices? All of these things that states need to critically think about now so that they can have the information in the future they need. To put a positive spin on a really negative situation in a rough year, you know, we can always look at this as the grand experiment in online and virtual learning. We've done school traditionally in the way that we do it now for hundreds of years. And we know that a lot of it works well. But we also know that with new technology comes new opportunities to do things differently. Students may learn differently and learn better in different situations. So that's one of the things that I hope we can learn from this pandemic, and what we're working with several states on is really looking to see if there are some students who've really excelled in this online world, in this virtual world, and how do we incorporate that into the classroom as we move forward, even post-pandemic. So those are the two big buckets I think we're working on with our state partners. Is one is understanding the learning loss that may have occurred. One of my partners at SAS, he is a former state teacher of the year, as is his wife, and they have 4 children. And we often joke, you know, they may have actually accelerated learning during the pandemic, having 2 state teachers of the year in their home. So while we expect some learning loss, there is so much that we don't still know. And from the Data Quality Campaign, they did an excellent survey of parents and found that 89% of parents want to know the impact of the school closures and COVID-19 on their students' learning. And furthermore, over 60% of parents really want to know student growth measures. They want to know how much growth their students made. It's critically important that we understand that. So we're working with our states to do that and make sure that we understand the learning loss. And also, as Javed said earlier, how it may or may not have impacted different types of students disproportionately. We assume that the equity gap will increase, but there are a lot of assumptions in that. I know that there's a lot of research that has gone out already saying we anticipate a 70% learning loss, or 2 times worth a year learning loss. But we really don't know. We don't have the data to back that up. So I would really encourage states, first of all, be cautious. We don't have the data yet to make those critical decisions and those critical statements of this is how much learning has been lost. There's a lot of assumptions baked into data like that, like, you know, it's going to be just like the summer slide was, and you can just multiply the months of the summer slide by the months of school closure. Well, statistically, from a statistician's company and an analytics company, that doesn't really hold water. You really have to wait until the data is there, but move forward as if we know that there's some catching up to do. And secondly, we're working with states to understand, in this grand experiment of online learning, what are the best practices we can take from here? So my encouragement to states is, one, be cautious in what you're saying and what statements you're making. Collect data now so that we can know information in the future, and be optimistic. Kids are incredible learners and they are resilient. I have a special needs son, and he surprises me every single day in the steps that he makes forward that no one said that he could do. And I know that kids can do that, but we have to set the tone for them. And then let's use the data critically to make really good decisions and understand the interventions that we're helping to support them in the future.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And I really appreciate your optimism there. I think that it's a nice, refreshing change of pace from a lot of the things that we been hearing the last 6 months or so. So I'd now like to turn it over to Superintendent Carmen Ayala, who is the Superintendent of the Illinois State Board of Education. Superintendent, can you talk a little bit more specifically about the supports that Illinois has provided to schools to promote, you know, these meaningful standards-aligned learning habits this school year?
Thank you. This school year is obviously like anything any one of us have ever seen before. Our students are returning to school this fall after having experienced 3 to 4 months of remote learning and a summer break without many of their normal educational activities at camps and libraries and community centers. Our educators are now tasked with cementing last year's standards, recovering the summer slide, and supporting this year's learning gains, all in a 9-month school year, while students are learning both in person and remotely. That feat already sounds overwhelming, right? So in August, the Illinois State Board of Education distributed a list of priority learning standards. What we did was we assembled a group of educators from across the state to help us focus on the standards that are the most foundational to the success at later grade levels and that lend themselves best to project-based and interdisciplinary learning, which is what we believe will have the most positive impact for students. Our approach is more of a continue forward approach instead of a remedial approach. Because if we take a remedial approach for many of our students, the gap will actually widen. And we don't want that to happen. This list of priority standards is a subset of our own Illinois learning standards. The advisory group wanted to help educators address the unfinished learning from spring in a very productive way, not by lowering expectations, but rather by going deeper into the most essential competencies. Thanks to the efforts of another statewide advisory group, we also gave districts learning recommendations for the fall with strategies and tactics for in-person, remote, and hybrid scenarios. We wanted our educators to know that they should continue assessing their students, but may need to use more formative rather than summative assessment tools. Students can learn without grades, yet they cannot learn without formative assessment and feedback. So what does that look like? We're encouraging our educators to use ungraded polls, to use surveys, quick writes, interviews, mini conferences, and learning logs to help students synthesize learning and help teachers gauge students' progress. Formats like multiple choice and true false may be easier to administer, particularly in a remote environment, but will not provide reliable information on what students are learning or on what interventions or coaching they might need. We're asking them to try 1-minute papers. Ask students 2 questions. First, what was the most important thing you learned? And second, what big question do you still have about the topic at hand? Assess equitably. We are encouraging our staff to provide multiple methods of work submission for students to demonstrate learning. Electronic, hard copy, digital portfolio, mail, pictures, videos, or whatever works for them. Offer retakes on assessments or other assignments. These can motivate the students to learn course material and give them a chance to demonstrate growth. Illinois isn't viewing this pandemic as a time to waive assessment necessarily, because assessments are a means of providing and collecting meaningful, clear, and timely feedback. Of course, students aren't the only ones who learn from the assessments. The assessments provide a way for teachers to learn about their students, and assessments can actually help mitigate the kind of confirmation bias that often leads to lowering expectations for what historically disadvantaged students can achieve. And this kind of feedback is an important part of the education process and can help increase student learning, motivation, and growth.
Yeah, thank you so much, Superintendent. And it just reminds me of my teaching days that, you know, students will meet you where you expect them to be. So I think that's a really important reminder for us. Next, we have Commissioner Van Dieven, who is from Missouri. And Commissioner, similar to Superintendent Ayala, can you give us an overview of how Missouri is thinking about measuring student growth equitably, both now, but also in the long term, you know, in the event that something like this happens again or something similarly distracting, I guess.
Sure, Julia, thank you. You know, before I do that, I'd like to give just a little bit of context of what's happening in our state right now. In Missouri, we have 555 LEAs across the state, and we have been planning since this spring for a little bit of a hiatus in this virus. I mean, throughout the summer as we were planning, we kept thinking that maybe the virus would decline and we'd be preparing for a resurgence in October. And so how we were, we're constantly altering those plans because that absolutely didn't happen, as you all are very well aware. It certainly didn't happen in Missouri. And so we started off the year at a different place than we had been planning for in June and July. So I think that's important when you start thinking about how we were ready to launch the year. So currently we have about 87% of our districts that are offering some form of in-person learning. Some of it's hybrid, some of it's full-time on-site. Parents have the option to do for using online in all of those cases. So that doesn't mean that all of our children in those schools are going on site, but at least 87% of our districts are offering that, which translates to about 75% of our students have access to that. And I expect that number to increase. I'm getting more and more feedback from our districts that they're planning to open schools, particularly to our youngest learners first. You're hearing a lot about that across the nation. So we'll see some staggered returns, I believe, by the start of the second quarter, which is in just a couple of weeks. So we'll be seeing more of that. On the flip side of that, because we are having so many students back in person, we're also seeing some school closures. Again, not massive school closures, but maybe classroom closures, large numbers of quarantine, large numbers of teachers potentially that may be in quarantine or not. And so it's been fluctuating. You'll see the headlines every day. This school's opening, this school classroom is closed. And I just met with a group of teachers a couple of days ago, and just to hear their responses. One teacher was like, it is great in the little rural community that hasn't had incident. Kids are so excited to be at the classroom. It's been a wonderful year. And then the next teacher saying, it's been a good year, but we're still struggling with identifying and finding where this particular child is, students who have moved. So what I'm trying to set out for there is we are working hard to establish an individualized growth model for our children when they come back in the door. But already you can see that there are some psychometric challenges. The situation is very different. To talk about a standardized situation right now just genuinely doesn't exist. But so how are we approaching that? I think first and foremost, there's two things. We are talking about the social emotional learning side of things. So we've invested in that, but we've also invested in what we're calling our MOLEAP assessments, optional to school districts, where we are allowing districts to assess maybe their fourth graders on third grade standards, that assessment to see where they left off in March, and then that information is to be given back to the teachers immediately so they understand, as Carmen just pointed out, it's not remediation. We just need to know what they need to know in order to be able to successfully transition to the next level. And that's really important for us. So working in that regard. A number of districts have opted not to use that assessment. So that's their choice to do so. But what we've tried to identify is similar to what Katrina said. We're going to be asked these questions at the end of the year. So we need to know now, what is that? What are the questions? And the questions are, are students learning? How do you know? And so if you're not going to use this test, how do you know? Because people are really forgiving. They've been great about everybody's adapting, lots of grace, lots of good things. And our teachers have been remarkable. But at the end of the day, as you said, parents want to know, did my child learn? Are they ready to go to the next grade level? And so spring assessments, how we'll be measuring growth there. We, like Illinois, are not prepared to waive that assessment, although that is not a popular choice with a number of people, as you can imagine. A lot of people, I got an email tonight, please consider waiving these assessments. It's important. I can think of no greater time that we would want to have a standardized tool in place. I can think of no greater time. So one of the items that we're collecting in addition to the enrollment data for our students is, what is the primary mode of delivery this year? Is it online? Are they in school, in the classroom? What does that look like? And then when we're calculating the growth metrics on that eventually, we want to use that as one of our comparative elements, because as you've said, kids are performing differently, behaving differently. Sometimes that's in the same household. So some of it is economic driven, some of it's personality driven. I mean, there's just so many factors that we need to look at, that if we try to do this as an aggregate performance, it doesn't help us. We have to get to the answer of what works for the individual child, and that individual student metric, student growth model that can accommodate a change in assessment is huge. We've got to find one that can accommodate a change in an assessment and give us really good information And I think the concern, and I'm probably going over my time here, I think the concern that most people have with the spring assessment is the accountability side. Let's talk about, I mean, there is accountability, no doubt about it, but the bottom line here is we have got to focus on student learning. This is an incredible time in our history in our nation, and we have an obligation to know. Even those people who don't want the test, they're demanding the information. They want to know. So let's find that balance, and thank you for the opportunity to join you tonight.
Thanks so much, Commissioner, and thanks for reminding us it's never a simple yes or no question. So next we have Gerald Bradford, who is an Executive Vice President with 50CAN. And Darrell, we've heard a lot about data tonight and the importance of data. And so can you discuss the importance of growth data and what are we talking about here and how does this serve students equitably?
Thanks for setting me up just to +1 everything everybody else said, which makes it easy. I will relinquish part of my time. So I just want, analogously, I like movies. And if anybody's ever seen this movie called Tuskegee Airmen, it's a pretty good movie. It's got Lawrence Fishburne in it. And it's all about the Tuskegee Airmen. And there's a part where they are they're in flight school. And the guy who's running that, the captain or whoever is running their class is a really horrible racist. And he won't let them move up to actually flying planes. And there's a scene where every one of the African-American airmen hands in his test for flight school. And the racist flight officer has to read the test results out loud. And it's like 90, 95, 99, 99, 95, 99. And it powerfully sets up the power of having some objective data out there, right? That is sort of beyond reproach. So I just highlight that to say, and here's where I'm gonna be like a little bit of the skunk at the garden party, and I'd like to thank the superintendent and commissioner for staying strong, but not everybody it's not even about what growth measure we're gonna use next year. Some people do not want to give this assessment, right? Or don't want to give any, and that even, is political and goes beyond whether or not there's any accountability attached to it, which is great. Let's talk about that. So I would just say, like, across our network, at the end of last school year, when schools were closing early, what we started to see was not just on assessments, but generally, was kind of like a race to the bottom in behavior from like a lot of school districts and district leaders. Like, I won't name names, but some district gave everybody A's, right? And I'm like, yeah, if you give everybody A's, guess what? Everybody's gonna think the low-income kid's A is not a real A, and everybody's gonna think the other kid's A is still an A, right? So what have you done? And given the option to close early, people just closed early, and there were just a lot of behaviors that sort of showed like the worst instincts of our institutions, not the best. And so for us, we have like maybe 3 things across our network that we've been super engaged on. One is protecting next year's summative assessment. Whether or not there's stakes attached to it is an open thing, but like, we think you gotta have it. As noisy or imperfect as the data is, a 1-year disruption in its collection, we feel like you might never come back from that. So that's very important to us. A start of the year diagnostic, big deal. Not all of our states are sort of taking that position. I know I have, and I know a lot of parents have, like, they, and you heard this several times from my co-panelists, people want to know, and parents want to know. And so I think Connecticut, Texas isn't one of our states, but they did it. Tennessee, where I know you are, Katrina, they've done an optional start of the year assessment. And so we think that's a great idea too. And then the other one, and then, there's other stuff we can talk about this too, that's maybe more fun. But the other one is like decisions about promotion. We want those to be had with the parent, right? And I really appreciate this discussion about not assuming that everyone has lost a year, because A, some kids have flourished, and B, like, some kids will catch up if you don't lower the bar, right? And there's kind of like a fight over which one of these strategies to take, depending on who you talk to. But whatever you do, like involving a parent in a decision about promotion or retention, sort of signifies the level at which we probably need other people involved in sorting out the implications for learning loss in the spring, the data we collect now over the next year. So we think that's kind of a cool thing too. So happy to discuss more later.
Thank you so much. And thanks for keeping it nice and brief. We always like that. But we're going to start now with our Q&A. So once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them into the Q&A section. We will be moderating them on our end and bringing them back to you. And we also have a great number of questions that have been sent in beforehand, so we'll be using some of those as well. But I'm going to start first with Katrina. Katrina, can you talk a bit about what states should be thinking about right now to ensure growth data can be calculated in the future?
Sure. So a few things. One, and Commissioner Van Dieven actually talked about this a bit in her remarks, is you're going to have a robust growth model. A simple gain model where you take 1 year and subtract the previous year isn't going to work in this instance, because you're going to have a gap year. So what we're talking with a lot of our states are a couple of things. One is, what does that growth model look like? What are the business rules around it? What do we use it for? Is it used for accountability? Most states are saying no on that, which personally I agree with. I think we need information and data in a safe space, so to speak, so that we can understand how kids are doing. But then also, how do you communicate it? Even if you use the same growth model, there's going to be a little bit of differences in past years because of this 2-year gap, the gap with no 2021 testing. But also be innovative. You know, there's a moment in time right now where we can't do what we've always done. We have to think differently. We also don't have the data that we've always had. And so I think a lot of times in education and really everything else, we just keep going. We keep doing what we've always done because there's momentum behind that. Well, COVID-19 kind of stopped that, and we're being able to reassess what information we have, what data we have, what we collect, what we have access to, and what we do with it. So we have a couple of states. One is looking at including different data. So we're looking at WIDA access for ELLs to see if we can measure growth and provide student projections for English language learners, which we haven't seen anywhere else. We're looking at communicating the information around benchmarks, using benchmark data, not in the growth model, but in what we call our student projections, where we're looking at how a student's performed in the past on all of their testing history in the past, and projecting to all future assessments that they may take and their likelihood of success on those. So we're looking at, can we use benchmark data to project to the spring 2021 assessment, so we kind of know the trajectory that our students are on now, and getting that information into teachers' hands as they're working with students. So states are being incredibly innovative and thinking, okay, if we can't have A, what can we do with B? And so we're seeing that. And also, again, this grand experiment in online learning, I think I'm going to coin that, because, you know, it's something that we've never done at this scale before. And just in my own world, you know, I see kids learn differently. They're so engaged by online tools and activities and videos and ABC mouse type things. So how are we using that in schools? How are we helping students progress in that way? We need to know if it's working. We can't just say, hey, go do it, and measure login times or screen time or engagement. We actually need to see if it's affecting learning. So we can use data, we can use growth measures to see, okay, how is this program impacting student learning? Are our kids actually learning in these online and hybrid courses? If so, let's continue them. Is there a certain type of student that's learning better here? How do we expand it? If not, let's move on. You know, intelligent fast failure is something that we talk about often. Make intelligent choices. If it doesn't work, fail quickly and move on to the next choice. So that's something I think that states are doing and being creative about, and also ensuring that we continue to assess not only kids' proficiency levels and achievement levels, but how they're growing and moving.
Thank you. And I'm gonna stick with the data theme here. Superintendent Ayala, how is Illinois using assessment data to measure the impact of the pandemic on student learning right now? Oh, and you are actually still on mute, Superintendent.
Oh, I keep forgetting about the mute, unmute. You know, as with any bad experience, and this pandemic certainly hasn't been necessarily a positive one. We know that, I lost my place here. Hold on just 1 second. It's even worse if you fail to learn from it, right? So we need to learn from this. There's some learning to be done during this pandemic, and therefore we're going to learn everything that we possibly can. So in Illinois, we are working with the Midwest Regional Educational Laboratory on a study to collect and analyze data that will give us insight into how student learning changed following the suspension of in-person learning. Commissioner Van Dieven mentioned that there were over 500 districts in her state. In Illinois, there are 852 separate, distinct, unique, locally controlled districts in Illinois. And each district has their own local assessments. We have the state assessment, which we are required to provide, and the accountability structures and all of that as all the other states have. But we set out to partner with the Midwest Regional Educational Laboratory to collect and analyze that local data. It's part of a network that is funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And so this study is going to focus on the schools that are serving 3rd through 8th grade, because that's where we know we have local interim assessments occurring on a regular basis. And specifically for schools that over the past 6 years have conducted what we term a type 1 interim assessment. That's not a locally developed assessment. It is an assessment such as AIMSweb, NWEA MAP, Renaissance Star, a vendor kind of third-party assessment. And that is aligned, most of them either aligned to Common Core or they align to the state's standards. The study will use this interim type assessment, whether virtually or in person, because we know we have school districts across the state that are continuing to use their interim assessments. And so we will share our data and send it over to Midwest Laboratories. The data we're messaging to our districts, because they get nervous about the whole accountability thing, that we are only using this for research purposes only, and that we want to see statewide what is the data saying about students, where they are when they come in during the fall, in the beginning of the school year. And we know that many of them gave their second and possibly even their third interim assessment before the pandemic hit. So what was the loss? And having 6 years of data, we can really begin to analyze that information. So each participating district will receive a report on their own results, and will also have the opportunity to participate in a coaching session with REL Midwest in order to understand how to interpret their results and the implications that those results might have for instructional practice. We'll receive the state level results, and that will help us in turn understand the relationship between the COVID-19 pandemic and student learning, and where we see areas of support. The other piece, and Katrina, you mentioned access. We have a large English learning population in the state of Illinois, and many of our districts were able to complete the access assessment prior to the closing of schools in the spring. And since we are going to be giving the assessment again in the spring, I think that we will be able to gather some information about the linguistic losses that our children may have experienced due to the pandemic. So that's kind of where we are in Illinois with how we're utilizing data.
Thank you so much. And Commissioner, how can schools think about flexibility in their curriculum right now while they're still ensuring that they have methods of equitably measuring growth, such as the Superintendent Ayala was just talking about?
Yeah, you know, I think Illinois, what you're doing in Illinois, we're doing something very similar. Missouri is a locally controlled state. We have our Missouri learning standards, but the curriculum is completely at the choice of the local district. So I think giving our schools the priority standards, outlining what is most essential this year in particular, and going from that point. I've been joking, I'm an English teacher, and if we have an entire generation of students who don't understand how to use the semicolon, I'm probably not gonna sweat it, you know? But if they can't read, we're in trouble. I mean, our children, they have to be able to do certain things, and they don't get this year back. We know they don't get this year back, and so we need to emphasize what are those essential components, what are the priority standards, and then measure on that so that we can see where students truly are. As far as the flexibility goes from there, you know, if I don't say it once, I'd probably want to say it 100 times tonight. I cannot brag on our teachers enough in this state. They have just stepped up to try to solve this. They are working together. Much of the learning that is taking place on how to do, as Katrina's identified, this new way of doing business, our teachers are leading that charge. They put together modules for what we're saying, you know, by Missouri teachers, for Missouri teachers. They are leading this charge and learning from one another. And to me, you know, that is going to be probably one of my biggest takeaways from this whole pandemic is the collaboration that must occur and the collaboration that has occurred to make sure that we don't let this year fall behind us. It's a great opportunity for growth and for learning.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And Darrell, just following up on kind of these last three questions, what opportunities has this experience really presented us? What would you say is one of the most important things that policymakers should consider when they're thinking about these opportunities and rethinking assessments and growth measurements?
Yeah, and I just want to say to the commissioner, I normally place a semicolon by feel, so just throwing that out there. So I just want to say, because like whenever you have this kind of conversation, you don't want to be ghoulish about it. So COVID is a serious thing, and it's done really bad things to lots of people, right? And lots of kids are living up front and personal with this and their families in a way that that is not good. So I just want to say that because I don't want to sound like an opportunist. At the same time, like this is the first time in everybody's lifetime on this call, unless somebody secretly looks incredibly young, right? That the majority of kids in America have been in school, not in a school building, right? They've been at home. They're in a pod. They're half there, half not there, whatever. So the entire the ritual loop of going to school has been disrupted. And for us, like we look at this as, like, and the New York Times had a piece about this maybe a month ago, where the headline was, maybe some kids are better not at school, like maybe some kids it's better, they're better at home. Like there's a great side note, there's a great Wall Street Journal letters to the editor from Cat and Dog. And Cat says, we need to go back to work. And Dog says, why can't everybody work from home? You should check that out if you want to. It's very funny. But to us, we're just like, if school isn't a physical place and learning is everywhere, like how do we reward or measure learning that happens everywhere? And so a lot of people have talked, earlier about like, the learning loss data, that was like NWEA and Zern, which is like a tech platform, like what are the opportunities and sort of data sharing agreements to spin up like immediate access to this kind of information in real time that lets you make better decisions about kids. Like that, what's the worst thing about annual assessments? You get them after the kids are gone and you only do them once a year, right? So the tech space, I guess, is kind of helping on that. We think that's really important. The other two things is like, standard assessment data gives state chiefs, department heads, whatever information that they can use about interventions and resource allocation, right? But that information isn't necessarily like, sexy to like a 12-year-old, I'm more interested in how many clicks I get on Instagram, whatever, right? So I only highlight that to say that there's a world of like apps and activities that happen out there that provide tons of data for people that they're interested in, right? And this is kind of like a different thing. It's like, what if you could do Strava for education, basically? You know, like there are people who are like, I don't care about these numbers, but they want to know the steps. You know, like that's a measurement paradigm that we could think about applying to education in sort of like a really interesting way. And then the last piece of that I would just say is just like, if you just assume learning is going to happen everywhere, right? And you can kind of spin up good ways to measure it or interesting ways to measure it. The third piece is like, how do you articulate it back to advancement in a K-12 context? Because like, if you learn, you know, if you can pick up physics in your spare time, right? And like, why can't we just award credit for it? You know, who cares if you are 12 years old and a savant? Like, do we need to have you take this again in high school when you get there? Like, can we award you college credit so that college costs less, you know, that kind of stuff. So those are the things we've been thinking about, like unweighted by the responsibility of actually having to give the assessments. We dream about these things. So yeah.
Thank you. And I will say that my dog is living his best life with me at home. So, but Superintendent, we actually had a follow-up question for you about your assessments and your partnership with the Regional Education Lab. Is the participation in the assessment optional currently? Actually, still on mute there. No, okay.
Sorry, I got a tickle in my throat there for a minute. Yes, as I mentioned, Illinois has 852 different school districts. Not all of them are able to give interim assessments because there are these other types of assessment that they can give. So we're really focusing on those type 1 assessments that school districts have chosen to give, which many of our districts do give, but it will be optional because we know that not all of the districts utilize type 1 types of assessments.
Thank you. And I just want to point out before we keep going in the questions, we have had a lot of really great questions sent in. And so unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I just wanted to flag that we will be finding ways to follow up on a lot of these, either through following up individually or through some sort of social media, Twitter town hall type event. So just please keep an eye out for that. But moving on, this one is for Commissioner Van Dieven. But of course, if anyone else wants to chime in, please feel free. Thinking about early childhood populations, you know, specifically pre-K and kindergarten, how are they thinking about measuring growth right now? And are they making any adaptations? And what does that look like?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. We're certainly not able to do that at the state level right now. I think a number of our schools are trying to do that through their kindergarten readiness. What we're watching for right now is something you've been hearing across the nation is what does our kindergarten enrollment look like? And I think that's something we all need to be paying close attention to. If enrollment numbers are down in kindergarten because parents are just saying, we'll sit this one out and start next year, what will next year look like when we might have a heavy populated kindergarten class, and then how will that appear? But all that aside, that is one of our top priorities for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education right now is early learning and access, high quality access to early learning opportunities. We can't stress this enough. I'm very sympathetic with our higher ed friends and some of what they're dealing with. And when they're talking about the gap year, and my continuous response to that is, but a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old doesn't get the chance for a gap year. The way the brain develops in this time period in their lives, they don't get that option. And so I'm falling short on your question on growth. I'd love to hear from some of the others if you have a response to how you would do that in the early learning world. But I will tell you that it has to be a priority for us at the state and quite frankly at the national level because again, this is such a formidable time for our youngest learners, and we need to make sure they're a focus right now.
What I can share with regard to Illinois and how we're measuring, Illinois has the kids assessments. It's a developmental assessment. It's a readiness assessment. And we generally have our kindergarten teachers doing a lot of observation and inputting the information within the first 40 days of school. And so we're able to take a look at that information in specific domains. What we have had to do, because many of our schools started the school year remotely, about 2/3 of our school started the school year in remote mode, we have extended that window. So we will still be collecting the kids' data, and so we'll still be able to see if there was a difference or how the domains, what the growth may have been or lack of growth with regard to those readiness indicators.
Thank you. And then I'm going to move on, and I'll direct this one towards Darrell, and then maybe Katrina, you can chime in too. Formative assessments, you know, they really play a critical role in helping students grow, but teachers sometimes need a lot of support to understand how to develop them and how to analyze the results and how to use those results properly. So how can teachers be supported to really incorporate formative assessments for student success, especially if they might be in a distance learning or hybrid situation?
So I have no idea how to answer that question, but I'll try. You know, I think the important thing, so, and this goes back to the whole question of accountability earlier. So, you know, I'm in a big work group with a bunch of organizations, you know, 50-can-like organizations. And, you know, one person was saying, well, you know, we appreciate the idea that you might want to give the assessments and remove the stakes. At the same time, removing the stakes sends the message that the assessment isn't important, right? So it's, you know, sort of like a catch-22 about human behavior. That said, like, that question, I don't think has like ever been answered because we've never had to answer it before, right? Like, how do you provide great PD so that somebody can act on formative data with millions of kids who aren't in the classroom? That's a new one. So I would just say, you know, one, like, even though we haven't deployed anything like this, you know, at scale across, like, you know, thousands of schools and hundreds of school districts, you know, there are local schools, some school networks, some, you know, like online providers, whatever, like them or not like them, who have been working on these things for a long time, and who, if they don't have the final answer, at least have a bevy of data that nobody ever thought they needed to use before, that now is probably very important. I'm on the board of a school that's going all virtual in New York, and we're answering these questions every day. You know, like what happened today? What did we learn? You know, like, and what do we share? You know, so maybe the good answer there, the best answer there, is that, like, you know, the best and worst thing about local control is that you get 15,000 shots at it, but you just can't control any of them. And this is probably like a very good time to think about collaboration. I know we've heard that, you know, from a couple of folks, but collaboration across sectors in a way that our normal political fights probably don't allow as well.
And I'll take a stab at that as well, and really focus on the world that I live in, which is using summative assessment around growth and some benchmark assessments. But I think it applies to the formative assessment question. And what, you know, I often see in the classroom is that teachers are given a number. You know, you scored at this scale score, or your student scored, or this was your average class, or this was your growth score, your value added score. But they don't get any information about what that really means or how to dig a little bit deeper into it. So I think anytime, one, you know, data literacy is incredibly important for teachers, because the data represents what your students know and understand and how you can better support them, but also it represents the effectiveness of your own practice. So it's incumbent upon those of us who provide information like growth, like assessment information, formative assessment, benchmark assessment providers, to help them understand that and give them the tools to think through it. So working with teachers, whether it be in training, or even if you have an online portal and you go in, is there information to guide you through what you're seeing, to help you understand, okay, does this apply to all of my students? Is it a subsection of my students? How is this performance impacting different groups? So digging into that information and then really making it simplistic, not because teachers don't have the ability to understand, but because they have so many other things that they're grappling with. You need to almost provide them the answer. So what does this mean? What's the so what of this? And how do I apply it in my classroom? And I think as we get more familiar with technology in this online world, and teachers are even more used to working with their students with this type of technology embedded, I'm hoping that we see more of that data literacy come, because those explanations are literally at their fingertips, instead of, you know, an esoteric report that you get once a year or a few times a year that really means nothing to you in your individual classroom practice.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And this one, I'm going to direct our Superintendent Ayala, but I think, Commissioner, this actually is something that would be relevant in Missouri as well. But Illinois, you know, they've developed this college and career readiness indicator to measure how well high school students are prepared for college upon graduation. Are you thinking at all about how to look at that in the context of the pandemic and some of the learning loss we're seeing, and, you know, rethinking it based on emerging new ways or models of measuring learning growth?
Oh, I'll get it straight eventually. It's all the different platforms we work with. Illinois was one of the first states to have their Perkins application and program submitted and approved. And so, you know, even with college and career readiness, there was a lot of conversation around the state around, do we give the SAT? The SAT is a graduation requirement. We did waive it in the spring because of, you know, schools being closed, but now that schools are open and they can choose to be in-person, hybrid, or remote, do we continue to require the SAT? And we looked at it from an equity lens. And when we set out to have it as a graduation requirement, for example, and I'm speaking about the SAT as an assessment, our children of color would have normally not taken the assessment because they would have thought they don't have access to college, to discover that, wow, I got a score that I could apply for scholarships and I can go to college. And so there's some equity issues there with this whole college and career readiness and those kinds of things. In Illinois, we're investing a lot in our CTE programs. What we're doing is creating pathways, dual credit pathways. When we're specifically targeting some teacher preparation, dual credit high school pathways to address some of the teacher shortage and in specific areas, and looking to really work with our students of color. Interestingly, when they take a survey of career interests, we had over 6,000 students that expressed an interest in education, but yet our schools were not diving into that and having conversations with students about going towards this career and technical ed pathway to become a future educator. And so the pandemic has presented some challenges because many of the career pathway programs also have their labs, if you will. And that has been a little bit of a challenge, particularly when the pandemic first was upon us. Now I think with being in person, schools are becoming very, very creative in terms of the labs, where the classroom portion might be done remotely, but then small groups of students are able to go into the labs. So we're seeing more of that. In Illinois, we are putting a priority on making sure that in-person is given priority to our children who are 13 years of age and younger. And so we do have more remote learning for our 14-year-old students and above. So those are just some highlights in terms of how we're dealing with career, technical education, college to career, those kinds of things, and the assessment that goes with that.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on that if I can as well. You know, I think right now and in the last several months, we keep saying the key word is pivot. If we say pivot one more time, we're just like that Friends episode where they're pivoting all, you know, we pivot, pivot, pivot. We were just talking about, we believe the next word will be reimagine. And it is time to really think about when we're reimagining education, just like all the other fields, that career and tech world is going to look potentially vastly different. What a chance for us to say what really does matter. So when we get out there and we start to measure some of those skills that are essential for a career workforce readiness skills, we usually get such a broad list. I think we'll be able to narrow those a bit and really think about what do we need to hone in on as a state in that. You know, we don't really have a growth metric for that. Julie, I want to point that out, but it's not to say we can't. I think it's something we certainly need to look at, and just like Carmen mentioned, we're redesigning our entire state accountability system to look at a success ready student and to think about what are some of those metrics that need to be in place for the success of every child as they move through our entire system. So we'll be certainly looking at that. I too, in this particular metric itself, go back to Darrell's question about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. This is an area where we did see some decline in students being able to participate in those on-site industry recognized credentials. Some of our testing sites were closed for periods of time. So some of those things got waived. And so what are we doing now? Did that help? Did that hurt? And how much can we count on intrinsic motivation, or do we need something out there as well?
Thank you so much. And oh, please, sorry, go ahead, Katrina.
Yeah, just really quickly, we're actually working with several states on both of those issues. So one is measuring growth in CTE. In North Carolina, they actually have teacher developed CTE exams, assessments, about 80 of those every year, and about 60% they're able to use in a growth measure. So we've been able to do that pretty consistently for several years. And then on the issue of college readiness, and we can see you, Margie, with your light on, with college readiness, we work with 5 different states in looking to see projecting that I was talking about earlier to likelihood of success on ACT, SAT, AP, as well as other, I forget the other one, the other college readiness exam, IB, International Baccalaureate, to see students' likelihood of performance on those exams. So it is possible if you have the data, and that's one of the things that we're excited about working with other states. And your kindergarten assessment, Superintendent Ayala, is just so interesting to see if we can start working with that data and do that type of work.
Thank you so much. And this has been a really rich conversation, and I wish that we had had time to get through all of the questions. And I think that, you know, we could have gone on for hours if it weren't, you know, a little bit late for some of us. But thank you again to all of you for joining us today. We had a really engaged chat going on there, so we really appreciate that. And I especially want to thank our panelists, Superintendent Ayala, Commissioner Van Dieven, Katrina Miller, and Gerald Bradford. We're really sorry if we didn't get to one of your questions today. Please feel free to tweet it at us at the Hunt_Institute using the hashtag #EdHomeroom, and we'll follow up. We really appreciate how engaged you've been, and like I said, we will be finding ways, such as a Twitter town hall, to follow up on some of these conversations. Additionally, we have recorded this, and we will be following up with a recap blog as well as the recording next week. So please feel free to check back for that. And then finally, the Hunt Institute has been working really hard to compile as many resources and learning opportunities as we can. So we have a number of upcoming webinars, and they are this Night Owl webinar series that we are trying. So next Tuesday, October 6th, for our Race and Education series, we'll be discussing identifying and supporting the human needs of children of color. I think that's going to be a really great conversation. Then Thursday, October 8th, we'll have an early efforts conversation about developmentally appropriate practice. And then on the 22nd, we will have another race and ed conversation on student perspectives on inclusion and equity in education. So once the webinar is over, you'll be brought to a really quick, brief survey asking about your experience today. That all this is anonymous. We use it for our own growth purposes. And then finally, thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.